"He's just a bartender," my mom snorted when I walked in. Then my sister's new husband shook my hand and froze. He turned pale, looked me up online for my watch brand, and suddenly everyone went silent when he told them what they found. I, 32M, walked into my parents' house on Sunday afternoon, dreading what I knew was coming. My sister had called earlier in the week to say she wanted the family to meet her new husband, and I'd been avoiding it ever since. I wasn't in the mood to be judged. The living room smelled like my mother's cooking, something with garlic and tomatoes. My parents were already seated when I arrived, my mother on her favorite chair by the window. My sister stood near the kitchen doorway. Her face lit up in that way it always got when she was about to announce something important. That's when I saw him. Tall, well-dressed, confident in the way that usually meant old money or good genes. He extended his hand toward me with a practiced smile. I shook it, expecting the usual pleasantries. But his hand went cold in mine. Not gradually, instantly. His grip loosened, and his eyes did something I'd never forget. They went wide, then narrow, then he looked away too quickly. His jaw tightened. He muttered something about getting a drink and left the room. My mother didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. She was already making her comment about him, her voice dripping with that particular tone she reserved for people she deemed beneath our family. She said something about how at least my sister had finally found someone, even if he was just a bartender. The words were meant as an insult, but there was relief in them too. My sister had been single for 3 years, and my mother had been counting. What my mother didn't know was that I'd built something in those 3 years. Something real. Something that had taken me from nothing to everything. I watched him disappear into the kitchen, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. He was probably already reaching for his phone. He'd be searching. He'd find it. My sister kept talking about how they'd met at an event, how he was so charming and successful, how he made her feel safe. I barely heard her. I was waiting. The tension in the room shifted, became electric in a way nobody else could feel yet. He came back about 5 minutes later, and he was different. Quieter. His eyes kept darting toward me, then away. He sat next to my sister, and I noticed his hand trembled slightly when he reached for water. My mother started asking him questions. The usual interrogation she put all of my sister's boyfriends through. Where did he work? Where was his family from? What were his intentions? He answered mechanically, his voice steady, but his body language all wrong. He was performing normalcy, while something inside him was breaking. That's when he did something strange. He asked me what I did for work. Everyone looked at me. My mother cut in before I could answer, saying I worked in tech, nothing particularly interesting, just computers and numbers. She'd never understood what I did, and she'd stopped trying about 5 years ago. I corrected her. I told him I'd actually moved into venture capital about 18 months ago, focusing on early-stage fintech companies. I mentioned, almost casually, that I'd recently closed a Series B investment round that valued the portfolio company at just over $200 million. I didn't mention my role in it. I didn't need to. He stood up abruptly, said he needed air. My sister tried to follow him, but he told her he needed a few minutes alone. The tension in the room became suffocating. My mother demanded to know what was wrong with him. My father, who rarely spoke, just watched me with an expression I couldn't read. I knew what was happening in that backyard. He was putting pieces together. He was remembering something he'd tried to forget. He was probably running my name through every database he could access on his phone. When he came back inside, his face had settled into something like resignation. He sat back down, didn't make eye contact with me, and told my sister he wasn't feeling well. He suggested they leave early. My sister protested, confused and hurt. She asked what had changed. He didn't answer her. He just kept looking at me with this expression of dawning comprehension mixed with something else, fear, maybe, or calculation. My mother was furious. She demanded an explanation. My sister was upset, asking if it was something she'd done. My father still said nothing. I let the silence stretch out. I let him feel it. I let him understand that I knew he knew that I knew. I excused myself to use the bathroom. When I came back downstairs, he was watching me again, and this time his eyes held something different. Recognition. Not just of who I was now, but of who I used to be. Of what he'd done. The afternoon fell apart after that. They left within 15 minutes, my sister confused, and my mother indignant. My father walked me out to my car as I was leaving. He asked if everything was okay, if there was something he should know about. I told him everything was fine, just a misunderstanding, nothing to worry about. He didn't believe me, but he didn't push. What he didn't know was that this had been a long time coming. Update 1. 3 days later, my sister called me. She was upset, wanted to know what was wrong with her husband, wanted to know if I'd said something that upset him. I told her I hadn't said anything, that sometimes people just have weird reactions to family situations. She asked if I had any idea why he'd been acting so strange since meeting me, why he suddenly seemed paranoid, why he'd been drinking more than usual, why he barely slept. I said I didn't know what she was talking about. She pushed harder. She said he'd been asking her questions about me, where I worked, what I did, whether I'd been successful, whether I'd ever mentioned knowing anyone like him. She said it was giving her anxiety, and she wanted answers. I told her I genuinely didn't know, and maybe she should ask him directly. She did. He denied everything, said he was just stressed about work. But that wasn't true. He was stressed about me. I spent the next week doing what I did best, research. I dug into his background, into his past, into the details he'd probably assumed had been erased. I found the company he'd worked for 8 years ago. I found the records of the acquisition that had been buried. I found the settlement agreements that had required everyone involved to sign NDAs. I found the names of the people who'd been hurt. I found my own name on a list of former employees marked as involuntary separation. He'd worked in HR back then. He'd been part of the team that managed the downsizing, the one that had been particularly vicious, the one that had involved fraudulent reasons for termination to avoid severance payments. I'd been 24 years old, fresh out of college, working my first real job. I'd been marked as a performance issue in the files, even though my reviews had been exceptional. They'd needed to cut costs, and they'd done it by destroying people. I'd fought it, tried to get hired somewhere else with that stain on my record, burned through my savings, nearly lost my apartment. It had taken me 2 years to rebuild my reputation. 2 years of contract work, of taking lower salaries, of retraining myself through online courses, of climbing back from absolute zero. Most people would have given up. Most people would have let it destroy them. I didn't. I got my degree, built my skills, found a company that gave me a real chance, worked 18-hour days for 5 years, and clawed my way into positions of actual power and influence. The watch I wore now cost more than his car. The apartment I owned in the city had a view of 3 rivers. My investment portfolio had 7 figures before taxes, and he was still working as a bartender, taking shifts at upscale hotels, pouring drinks for people wealthier than he'd ever be. My sister called me again 2 weeks later. She said he wanted to meet. Just me. He wanted to talk about something important, something he should have addressed a long time ago. She said he seemed genuine about it, that whatever was bothering him seemed to matter. I agreed to the meeting. Update 2. We met at a coffee shop in the city, neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled when he reached for his coffee cup. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He said he knew who I was. He said he remembered me from 8 years ago. He said he'd been going through some things lately, trying to be a better person, trying to make amends for past mistakes. He said the moment he shook my hand, something clicked. He'd gone home and looked me up, and everything had come back. Who I'd been, what had happened to me, what he'd done. He asked me if I still remembered, if I still thought about that time, if I still had nightmares about the way they destroyed my career before it had even started. I didn't answer directly. I just looked at him. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been a different person back then, that he'd been young and ambitious and had let his bosses override his conscience. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd always regretted how they'd handled the downsizing, that he'd tried to push back but had been overruled. He said seeing what I'd become, seeing that I'd somehow survived and thrived despite what they'd done, it had made him face what he'd contributed to. I asked him if his apology was supposed to change something. If he thought saying sorry 8 years too late was supposed to fix the foundation they'd cracked in my life. If he really thought words could undo the damage. He didn't say anything. He just looked down at his coffee. I told him that his apology was noted, that I appreciated the sentiment, but that I'd already moved on, that I'd built something real from the wreckage they'd left behind, that I was happy now, genuinely happy, in a way that had nothing to do with them or his guilt or his desire for redemption. He looked relieved. He thought that was the end of it. He thought I'd forgiven him, that we could move past this, that everything would be fine. That's when I told him that I'd also been in contact with the other people they'd let go, that I'd been documenting the fraud, the falsified records, the systematic abuse of the downsizing process. That there were lawyers involved now, lawyers who specialized in employment law, lawyers who understood what had happened and were building a case. I watched the color drain from his face. I watched him understand that this wasn't over, that this had never been about forgiveness, that I'd been patient, methodical, and was now ready to move. He asked what I wanted. If this was about money, if I was trying to extort him, if I wanted him to confess to something he'd only partially participated in. He said he wasn't even in a position of power anymore, that going after him would just hurt my sister, would destroy her marriage, would create collateral damage that he didn't deserve. I told him that he was right, that I wasn't interested in destroying my sister's marriage, but that his former company, the one that had never properly addressed the fraud, the one that had moved forward and grown wealthy on the backs of people like me, that was different. That entity deserved whatever consequences were coming. He asked me if I really thought this would work, if I really thought lawsuits and documentation would actually lead to anything meaningful. He said the company had lawyers, had resources, had the ability to bury this for years. I smiled. I told him that was probably true, but that I also had lawyers now and resources and a financial stake in making sure this went through. I told him that I'd spent 8 years building something bigger than anger. I'd built power, and I was finally going to use it. Update 3. The case settled 6 months later. The company paid out just over $4 million to a class of 12 former employees, including me. It wasn't life-changing money. I had that already. But it was justice. It was acknowledgement. It was proof that what they'd done mattered, that it had consequences, that you couldn't destroy people and just move on. He testified, finally, as part of the settlement agreement. He admitted what he'd known, what he'd tried to prevent, what he'd ultimately allowed to happen. His company asked him to resign before the settlement was finalized. They couldn't have him testifying against them and working for their competitor at the same time. They told him it would be a conflict of interest. My sister asked me what I'd done. She'd figured it out eventually, pieced together the timeline, understood that I'd been orchestrating something bigger than just a family meeting. She was angry at me for not telling her, for not giving her the choice to know before she married him, for using his guilt against him. I told her that I hadn't used anything against him. I'd simply allowed the truth to exist. I'd allowed consequences to follow actions. I'd allowed justice to happen in a system that usually protects people like him. She said that wasn't justice, it was revenge. She said I destroyed her husband's career because I was still angry about something that happened 8 years ago. She said I'd let my past poison her present. I didn't argue with her. She was half right. Maybe it was revenge. Maybe the line between justice and revenge is blurrier than we like to admit. But I knew that what had happened to me wasn't something that just got forgotten because time had passed. I knew that the people who hurt me didn't deserve to move forward untouched. And I knew that I could have either let that destroy me, or I could have built something better than anger. I'd built both. I'd built success, and I'd built accountability. My sister eventually forgave me, or at least decided to get past it. Her husband got a job at another company, lower position, lower pay. He had to move back to the suburbs where his family was from. He saw my sister on weekends. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about that coffee shop conversation, if he replays it in his head, if he understands the architecture of what I'd done, if he realizes that I'd been planning something the moment I shook his hand and he went pale. My mother never understood what happened. My father asked me once if I regretted it. I told him the truth, that I didn't regret it, that I couldn't regret it, because regretting it would mean accepting that what happened to me didn't matter. It mattered, and now everyone knew it.